Exodus chapter 22, and our text for this month, maybe next month too, will be verses 21 through 27. We'll see how long it takes to teach through these verses. There's so much good meat, good manna in here that I don't want to leave any stone unturned. So I think you'll see that as we read this, concentrate on the text of Scripture, recognize it is not the words of man, it is the words of Almighty Yahweh. You must not exploit a foreign resident or oppress him, since you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. You must not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, they will no doubt cry to me, and I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. Then your wives will be widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to my people, to the poor person among you, you must not be like a moneylender to him. You must not charge him interest. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak as collateral, return it to him before sunset, for it is his only covering. It is the clothing for his body. What will he sleep in? It's a question. What will he sleep in? And if he cries out to me, I will listen, because I am compassionate. May Yahweh bless His word to our hearts today. Has anybody here ever felt like you're the odd person that gets left out of something? A group or a community. Sometimes it's because we're just new and it takes some time to acclimate into a new group. But other times people get left out because those in the familiar group don't really want to let in an outsider or someone new. Nothing is wrong with a person, it's just that they're new and thus they're different. Well, this particular section of the Torah we just read is about the disadvantaged members in a community. The most vulnerable people in the community, the ones that could be taken advantage of. People who are not born into a community or have fallen on hard times. We have the foreign resident, the widows, the orphans, and the poor. Yahweh knows that it's the tendency to overlook and neglect these groups of people. So He gives us instructions over and over again in the Torah to make sure we look after and take care of them. When you group all of the commandments that have to do with taking care of these particular people in the Torah, they far outweigh any other commandment Yahweh ever gives. Today we're going to look at the first person on the list. That's the foreign resident. And we started off with Exodus 22:21. I want to give three parallel texts to Exodus 22:21. Some of these you'll probably be familiar with. The first is Exodus 20 verse 10 in regards to the Sabbath commandment. It says, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to Yahweh, your Elohim. You must not do any work. You, your son or daughter, your male or female slave or servant, Ebed and Amah, your livestock, or the foreigner who is within your gates. So the foreigner got to take off Shabbat too. Leviticus 19, 9 through 10 and 33 through 34. When you reap the harvest of your land, you are not to reap to the very edge of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You must not strip your vineyard bare or gather its fallen grapes. Leave them for the poor and the foreign resident. I am Yahweh your Elohim. When a foreigner lives with you in your land, you must not oppress him. You must regard the foreigner who lives with you as the native born among you. You are to love him as yourself, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh your Elohim. And the last of the sampling of verses is Deuteronomy 10, 18 through 19. We sang a portion of it earlier. Yahweh executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreign resident, giving him food and clothing. You also must love the foreigner, since you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. Yahweh is concerned with a foreign resident in the land of Israel, and He calls us to share in that concern, whether we are Israel or joined to Israel and we have somebody pop up that's different, that's new. He calls us to share in that concern. And the way that Yahweh takes care of the foreign resident is through the concern and protection from the native Israelite. So it's Yahweh taking care of the foreign resident, but He calls us to be the agents or the vehicle through which they're taken care of. We want to define the Hebrew word here. In Exodus 22:21, the words foreign resident and foreigners come from the same Hebrew word, and that is the Hebrew word ger, transliterated G-E-R. You're going to get familiar with this word over this sermon and maybe a few more. The verse itself helps to define the Hebrew word ger. Always remember this. Words are defined by the context in which they are used. We don't want to go to a lexicon and cherry pick a definition. We want to look at how the word is used in its immediate context. And here we see that the word ger, or foreigner, means someone not directly connected to Israel. We know that for sure because the last part of the verse says, since you, the Israelites, were gerim, or foreigners, plural, in the land of Egypt. Were the Israelites Egyptians? No. So we know this means someone that you're not directly connected to. The Israelites and the Egyptians were two different people groups. Now, somebody might say that Shem and Ham, sons of Noah, were at one time brothers. Israel came from Shem, Egyptians came from Ham. And that's true, but they went their separate ways. You have the Table of Nations, I think, in Genesis 10, and then you have another separation in Genesis 11 at the Tower of Babel. So they went their separate ways, and by the time frame of the beginning of the book of Exodus, the Egyptians, or the Hamites, were an entirely different people group who enslaved harshly the Israelites. You know the whole story of Moshe, the plagues, the Passover, the Exodus from the land of Egypt. So in Exodus 22:21, Yahweh is saying this, you Israelites were gerim, or foreigners, in a land that was not yours, and you were mistreated. Therefore, don't treat foreigners in your land like that. That's the commandment. Was the ger a foreigner who just lived in the land of another people? Or was it a foreigner who had joined themselves to another people? We see both uses of this in the Hebrew Bible. One here is in Genesis 23, 3-4. We read, then Abraham got up from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. The Hittites were a group within the Canaanite peoples. Abraham says this, I am a resident alien, the Hebrew there is ger toshav, among you. Give me a burial site among you so that I can bury my dead. Was Abraham joined to the Hittite nation? No, he wasn't a Hittite. He didn't say, I'm going to join your people and serve your mighty one. But he was a guest. He was a sojourner in their land. He was a peaceful sojourner in their land. As we see here, he wanted to acquire a burial site for his deceased wife. Here's another one in Deuteronomy 14:21a. It says, you, speaking to Israel, are not to eat any carcass. Some Bibles translate that as you are not to eat any animal that has died of itself. I think that's probably a better translation. KJV, Revised Version, JPS Tanakh, all read that way. Then he says, you may give it to a resident alien within your gates, and he may eat it. Or you may sell it to a foreigner. For you, speaking to Israel, are a holy people belonging to Yahweh your Elohim. Now, there's a difference here between the resident alien and the foreigner. I did not know this until I studied this a couple weeks ago. The first one, the resident alien, is the word ger. And the law here says that you can give an animal that has died of itself to a ger for them to eat. You can give it to them. But then it says you are allowed to sell an animal that has died of itself to a foreigner. And I used to think foreigner and resident alien was the same person, but it's actually not. The second foreigner there is the Hebrew word nakri. So the ger is closer to Israel than the nakri. But still in this verse, you see that the ger has not completely joined to Israel. We know that because the same law doesn't apply in this text to the Israelite and the ger. So you can give away an animal that's died of itself to a ger. You can sell it though, sell the animal and make profit on it to the Nakri. What's a bit peculiar here is a text like Exodus 12 verse 48. It reads, if a foreigner, ger, resides with you and wants to celebrate Yahweh's Passover, every male in his household must be circumcised, and then he may participate. He will become like the native of the land. I think that means he becomes an honorary Israelite. He doesn't have Israeli blood, but he's fully joining to the Israelite people, so he becomes like a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person may eat it. I think I taught on this last year before Passover. Uncircumcised here and circumcised means not in the covenant and in the covenant, right? It doesn't mean that every man today that is circumcised in the flesh is joined to the covenant of Yahweh, right? You've got to have the flesh and the heart to be in the covenant of Yahweh. So here we have this ger. He's not completely joined to Israel, but he's residing in the land. We know that because if he wants to celebrate the Pesach, he has to take on the covenant sign. The covenant sign is circumcision, physical circumcision. Genesis 17, Father Abraham and his descendants, and also those born in his house and those he purchases as servants. It says Abraham is to circumcise. So a ger can be joined completely to Israel by circumcision and commitment to Yahweh. In Exodus 12:49 it says, after that, the same law, the same Torah, will apply to both the native, that's the Israeli, and the foreigner, the ger, who resides among you. Now, the only way that you can harmonize these verses with Deuteronomy 14:21, where you can give the animal that's died of itself away to the foreigner, is to recognize that sometimes the ger lives in the land of Israel, but he has not completely committed to the Elohim of Israel. They are a peaceful dweller, though, in the land. And the ger does abide by some of the Torah. We're not talking about a murderer or a rapist or adulterer or whatever. It is a peaceful dweller in the land of Israel. He may not be, or she may not be completely joined, but they're a peaceful sojourner. That's Deuteronomy 14:21a. What we see right here in Exodus 12:48 through 49 is that the particulars of the Torah now become applicable to the ger from the nations when they take on the fullness of the covenant loyalty and commitment to Yahweh. Because of this, there is a later Hebrew way of distinguishing the two people. Now, you won't find this specifically in the written Torah, but what you will find is differentiation contextually between a sojourner ger and one that has committed to Yahweh completely. And so therefore they're called the ger toshav. Remember, Abraham was called that to the Hittites. I'm a ger toshav, I'm a resident alien. That's Deuteronomy 14:21a, the one you can give this animal that's died of itself to. But then you have the ger zedek in Exodus 12:49. The same law applies to both the native and the foreigner. The word zedek, you're familiar with it, you may not realize it, but when we say the word Melchizedek, it means king of righteousness. So the ger zedek would be the righteous foreigner. He's completely joined and committed to Yahweh. The ger toshav would be the peaceful foreigner, the sojourner that hasn't completely committed to Yahweh through circumcision, the male, but yet he wants to live peacefully in the land of Israel because it's a great place to live. What is neat here is that the Greek translation of the Torah shows this early BC understanding. Remember, the Septuagint Torah was written beginning around 250 BC, so roughly 250 years before the birth of the Messiah. The Septuagint, when it's speaking of what we would call one ger, translates this as the par oikos, the neighbor or the sojourner. But when it talks about the fully joined ger, the ger zedek, it translates it as proselytos. Now that should sound familiar to you, proselytes. In Brother TJ's lessons through Acts chapter 2, we have both Jews and proselytes, and they're all considered devout Jews. See? So there's no people from the nations uncircumcised there that get baptized in Acts chapter 2. It's strictly people of Israel or proselytes that are honorary Israelites. So the Hebrew Bible doesn't differentiate it that way, but we know it was understood based on the Septuagint at least 250 years before the time of the Messiah, from the paroikos, the neighbor, and the proselytos, the full convert. It is important to note that the foreign resident being spoken about in Exodus 22:21 is always a peaceful foreigner, not just any foreigner. The Israelites were not required to open their land up to anybody and everybody that just wanted to come into their land. Even when this particular person has not completely joined to the nation of Israel, they live in the land of Israel peacefully, and they are called and required to abide by all of the laws that are considered capital. So like, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, and even remember the Shabbat day to keep it holy. So the foreign resident is not going around worshiping idols. He's not whispering in an Israelite's ear saying, hey, let's go worship this idol and that idol. He's not abusing the sacred name. He's not breaking Shabbat. And of course, no murder, adultery, or theft is going on. The command to love the foreign resident is not a blanket statement to let any and every foreigner into the land of Israel. We know this because we talked about last month in one of my messages about how the Amalekites were supposed to be destroyed by King Saul. Remember 1 Samuel 15? Yahweh told King Saul through prophet Samuel, go in and destroy all of the Amalekites, even the animals. Don't leave any of the animals. And then we have texts like Deuteronomy 7, remember the 7 nations of Canaan, where he says, break down their altars, destroy their images, cut down their groves, don't make any marriages with them, right? Why? They're heathens. They don't want to live in your land peacefully. They want to take over your land and make it a land towards their mighty one. So the Israelite was not required just to have open borders and allow anybody and everybody to come into their land. Now this is not to say that on occasion you might have a Nakri. One of those people that you can make a profit off of that animal that died of itself. Well, you might have one of those Nakri, Amalekite or Canaanite. They may occasionally have a genuine change of heart and want to forsake their people and join completely to the people of Israel. We will get to this in a future sermon, probably this month, but Isaiah 56, 1 through 8 is, I think, the penultimate text there, where he says, don't let the son of the stranger saying, Yahweh hath utterly separated me from his people. Because if you love the name Yahweh and you keep the Sabbath and you join completely, he'll give you a name better even than the sons and the daughters. He says the same thing to the eunuch, the physical eunuch. The key is that these foreigners did not approach Israel with an agenda. They wanted to be there to participate in honoring the mighty one of Israel. So even a Nakri could have a change of heart, and a Nakri could become a Ger Tzedek. But then you have people also that were Ger Toshav. This would be what Cornelius was in Acts chapter 10. Cornelius was a Ger Toshav. He was a peaceful man to the nation of Israel. He had a good reputation with the nation of Israel. He gave alms to the poor, probably even alms to the Jewish nation. But he wasn't circumcised. So therefore he didn't eat the Pesach. He couldn't eat the Pesach based on Exodus 12, 48 through 49. But he could abide by every law that was applicable to him, even as a Ger Toshav. Am I doing okay, Brother Sandy? Mm-hmm. When someone decides they want to serve Yahweh, it does not matter where they came from or what they look like. You could come from Millstead, Georgia. You could come from Conyers, Georgia. You could come from British Columbia, Canada. You could come from Nairobi, Africa. Right. What matters is not where you came from or what you look like. What matters, where is your heart and where is your mind focused? Yahweh is not looking at you to see what your last name is. Yahweh is not looking at you to see what the color of your skin is. Yahweh is not looking to see if you speak with a certain accent. What He is looking to see is, where is your allegiance? Where is your loyalty? Do you want to walk in covenant with me? In Acts 10, 34 through 35, this will be a string of verses Brother TJ will eventually get to as he teaches through the book of Acts. It'll be a while. It's in Acts chapter 10. That's okay. I like slow and steady myself. I enjoy that. But it says this, and there's such a big context to this in the whole 10th chapter of the book of Acts, but I can't preach a whole lesson on Acts chapter 10. But this is the Apostle Peter. Apostle Peter was chosen by Yahweh to be the first voice to reach out to the open door of the nations, the uncircumcised, to welcome them into the Messianic faith. Peter opened his mouth and he said this, "In truth, I perceive that Elohim shows no partiality, but in every nation, whoever fears Him and works righteousness is accepted by Him." We have two great truths here. One is Yahweh doesn't show any partiality. Some Bibles say He shows no favoritism. Some Bibles say He's no respecter of persons. The Greek text here, this is the Greek word, I might butcher it when I try to say it, but it's prosopolymptes. It's only used one time in the New Testament and it's never used in the Septuagint. But it's a compound word. It comes from two Greek words. Catch this. The first one is prosopon, which means the face. And the second one is lambano, which means to take the face. Strong's defines this word, and other Hebrew lexicons defines this word as literally an acceptor of a face. Elohim is not an acceptor of a face. When He looks to see who His child is, He doesn't look what your face looks like. Thank goodness for me. Sometimes I wake up in the morning and look in the mirror, and sometimes I don't like what my face looks like or what my beard and my hair looks like. Your beard will be all crazy, won't it, Brother Jerry? Elohim's not an acceptor of a face. So that's one great truth. But the second great truth here is this. He is an acceptor of every nation, ethnos. Ethnos there in the Greek. It can be used of Israelite. It can be used of non-Israelite in the Septuagint. He's an acceptor of every nation. To who? Those who fear Him and who work righteousness. One time I was teaching on the Torah and I was teaching about righteousness by what we do, and somebody accused me of teaching of works righteousness. "You're teaching works righteousness, Brother Matthew." I said, well, that phrase is only used one time in the Bible, right here in Acts 10:35. And it says Elohim accepts every nation that does what? Fear Him and works righteousness. Now we all know there has to be a change of heart first, and Yahweh has to show mercy on a person first. We all know that. We love Him because He first loved us. But if that's genuine, you'll fear Him and you'll work righteousness before Him. That's talking about personal righteousness. You'll do what is right. People will look at you and say, "That's a righteous man. That's a righteous woman," because of what you do. This is what Elohim is looking for. Not an acceptor of a face, but looking at what you do. Where is your allegiance? When it comes to who Israel is, Israel certainly began as a physical people group. It starts off here with Father Abraham. His dad was an idol worshiper. But Abraham was called in Genesis 12 from the Ur of the Chaldees. He said, "Walk before me and be blameless to a land that I will give thee." And then in Genesis 15 He said, "Look at the stars of the heavens. I'll make your seed as numerous as the stars of the heavens." And Abraham did what? He believed what Yahweh had said. He pledged allegiance. He said, "I want to follow you. I believe." So Abraham was a physical man, but it wasn't his physicality, his genetics, or his father that made him blessed and righteous in Yahweh's eyes. You know what made Abraham the man he was? He was a faithful man. He was a man of faith. A man of faith will be a faithful man. You can say, "I'm a man of faith," but not be a faithful man, and you're not really a man of faith. So Abraham was faithful, and he fathered Isaac. And Isaac fathered Jacob, and Jacob fathered his 12 sons and a daughter, Dinah. And then each son, a multitude of people, physical people. But which ones were really the people of Yahweh? Was it the ones that had the physical and not the spiritual? Or was it the ones that had both the physical and the spiritual? Well, it had to be the ones that had both the physical and the spiritual. Because as time progressed, Israel was called to honor Yahweh. And there were men in physical Israel who did not honor Yahweh. I'll mention two of them right now. Their names were Hophni and Phinehas. Thoroughbred, not just Israelites, but thoroughbred Aaronites. They were sons of the priest, the high priest Eli. And they had genetic Aaronic blood running through their veins. So they qualified physically to be priests. But they were wicked men. They got some of the meat from the sacrifices too soon. They laid with the women at the door of the tabernacle, committing lasciviousness. They despised the Torah, so much so that they were called sons of Belial. Belial is a Hebrew word that originally meant worthlessness, vain. Eventually, Belial became a title of Satan. You find this in 2 Corinthians 6, where it says, "What fellowship hath light with darkness, and what communion hath Christ with Belial?" It's talking about what communion hath the Messiah with the devil. Eli's sons were physical Israelites, but they were not spiritual Israelites. They were not in covenant with Yahweh. And therefore, eventually, Ichabod was written upon the door because the glory had departed from the priesthood. So at that point, their physical ancestry did not make them truly Israel. Israel means ruling with Elohim. You don't rule with Elohim just because you're physically Israel. You rule with Elohim if you're spiritually ruling with Elohim. Now, on the other hand, we did have people from the tribes outside of Israel who decided to leave the Elohim of their people, leave the ways of their people, leave the land of their people, and join to Yahweh's people and live in the land of Israel. And then you'd have even the Gerzetic who said, "I want to go all the way with Yahweh. I want to eat the Pesach, so I'm going to be circumcised, even as an adult." That's a pretty big commitment. Us men would know that, right? Pretty big commitment. I'm glad I was done when I was a little boy. But you know what? Somebody asked me the other day, they said, "Brother Matthew, if you weren't circumcised physically, would you be?" I answer without hesitation, yes. And you know why? It's because I want to go all the way with Yahweh. That doesn't mean that an uncircumcised man like Cornelius cannot receive the messianic blessing and be baptized into the Messiah. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that I want to go all the way. I want to eat the lamb at the Pesach meal. I want to be the Ger Tzedek. I want to be like Rahab the Canaanite. I want to be like Jethro the Midianite. People who did not have a physical connection to Jacob, Israel, but they had a spiritual connection to Yahweh. And so these people would become children of Israel or sons and daughters of Abraham. Why? Because they wanted to be like Abraham. They wanted to carry the characteristics of Abraham. In John 8, Yeshua told a group of Jewish men, "If you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham. Why are you seeking to kill me then, a man that have told you the truth? If you were really Abraham's children, you would not seek to kill me. You would recognize I'm the promised Messiah. You would recognize I'm the chosen servant." So you had some in physical Israel like Hophni and Phinehas who abandoned the covenant and lost that title, ruling with Elohim Israel. You had some that were not physical Israel, but they said, "Phooey on how I grew up, I want to be part of this. I want to be part of Deuteronomy 4 where I see Israel following the laws of Yahweh. What great people this is, and what great nation that has these great laws and this great mighty one as you, Israel." So this is ultimately what matters. We don't check someone's pedigree, ancestry, skin color, or biology to see if they're able to serve Yahweh. We don't say, "Show me your pedigree papers," to see if they're able to be a servant. The only requirement to be a servant is your heart with Yahweh. 2 Chronicles 16:9 says, "Yahweh's eyes go to and fro about the earth, and He's looking for somebody whose heart is completely His." Not an acceptor of the face, but looking for the heart. Proverbs 27:19 says, "Just as water reflects a man's face," you ever looked in water and seen a reflection of your face? It says, "So the heart is reflected by what a man does." That's the Matthew Jansen translation. King James reads a little bit different. But it's the same thing. Just as water reflects a man's face, the heart gets reflected by what a man does. I don't like it when people say, "Well, you don't know his heart, Brother Matthew." Yes, I do. You can know a person's heart by what they practice. Now, we all stumble in many ways. James 3:1, Yaakov 3:1. But I'm talking about practice, like a doctor practices medicine. You know a person's heart by how they live, what they practice all the time, their lifestyle. See? So I'm not sure if I am an Israelite. I could be. It's possible. I might have 1% Israelite blood in me. I might have 50%. I might have 99%. I might have 0% Israelite blood. I could be a ger toshav, or I like to think a ger tzedek. But what really matters? In every nation, he that feareth Elohim and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. Matthew 12, 46 through 50 is an account where Yeshua was speaking to some people, and his mother, biological mother and biological brothers. You know, Yeshua had brothers. They were half-brothers. I believe he was born of a virgin. It was a supernatural birth. But yet I believe Mary had other children. All right? Whether it be through Yosef before he died or through another husband after Yosef died. But people like Yaakov or James and Jude, Yaakov and Yehuda, they were half-brothers of Yeshua. So his mother and his brothers were standing outside and they were waiting to see him. And somebody came in and told him, Yeshua, your mother and your brothers are standing outside. He said, who is my mother? And who are my brothers? Now, he's not dissing his family. He's not throwing away his mama. He's making a point here. He says there in Matthew's Gospel, whoever does the will of my Father in heaven, the same as my brother, sister, and my mother. Do you know, sometimes we get made fun of because we say Brother Jerry and Brother Sandy and Brother Rocket. But the reason we say that, Sister Roseanne, is because of this text. You've ever heard somebody talk about the church mother? It's because of this text. Who is my family? Those that look a certain way? Those whose face is a certain color? No. Those who do the will of my Father in heaven. Luke 8:21, a parallel text, records Yeshua as saying, my mother and my brothers are those who hear the word of the Almighty and do it. Hear and do makes you Yeshua's family. So it's about what we practice, not how we look or who we are biologically. Some people today are better and easier to receive these texts because they've had biological family that has been mean to them, treated them like dirt, or forsaken them. It breaks my heart when I talk to men, sometimes old men I'm talking to, and they said, I never had a dad that loved me. I read of one man today who had his 60th birthday, and he said on his post there on Facebook, he said, my dad would curse me out and hit me, and I never heard I love you from my dad, and he was never there. I don't know what that's like because I had a dad that loved me, and I had a mama that loved me. But people that have experienced that in their life, or other family members that have deserted, left, mistreated, been mean, treated them like dirt, and then they all of a sudden join a church family. And they've got people in their church family that love them more than their own biological family. Or a child whose parent has abandoned them, and then they get adopted into a family that loves them and takes care of them and nurtures them and does things with them. And you ask that little child, who's my dad? Who's my mom? Those that take care of me, see. Those that love me, see. Family does not mean genetics. Family means love and care. When Yochanan the washer, John the Baptist, I like Yochanan the washer better because I don't want anybody thinking he was a Baptist denominationally, right? When he was preaching his message of repentance there on the banks of the Jordan River, repentance, baptism, now the TJ's mentioned this, I mentioned this in a Bible study recently. He had some Pharisees and Sadducees show up to see what he had to say. Some of that could have been because they were nosy. Some of it could have been they're required to go check out the prophet. Now you got to realize the Pharisees and the Sadducees were two of the strictest groups within Judaism. We should not speak of Second Temple period Judaism. We should say Second Temple period Judaisms, plural. Three major groups, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes. You had the Zealots, but they branched off from there. There were 7 different types of Pharisees in Pharisaism. The word Pharisee comes from the word perushim or parash. It means to be a separatist. They separated themselves. They considered themselves the holiest sect in Judaism. Paul talks about this in his recounting of his conversion. These were strict groups. That does not mean they had everything right, but they were sticklers when it came to their rules and their regulations. Sticklers. Well, they showed up to Yochanan the washer's baptism. Now remember, Yochanan, his parents were Zechariah and Elisheba. Luke chapter 1. Zechariah and Elizabeth. They were in the priesthood, Zechariah. But Zechariah's wife, she had to be a Levite too, because the Torah says in Leviticus 21, a Levite priest can only marry what? Another Levite, right? Can't marry a widow, can't marry a divorced woman. He has to be married to another Levite woman. So Yochanan the washer is a thoroughbred Levi, Aaronic priest. And he's out in the wilderness with camel hair garments and a leather belt around his waist, and he's eating wild honey and locusts. Not the locust bean. He's eating actual grasshoppers. All right, that's his diet. He's a wild man. He's a prophet. So when somebody tells you they're a prophet, look at their life. Do they live like Yochanan? Do they live like Prophet Isaiah? No, they probably drive a Cadillac, right? Live in a 10,000 square foot house. That's not a prophet. Prophets live monastic lives. They live by themselves. Why? Because they were close to Yahweh. Brother Matthew's not a prophet. I'm a teacher, pastor, yes, not a prophet. Not a prophet. Yochanan could have pulled the rank on him. Hey, I'm a son of Aaron. What does he say? Matthew 3:9. You Pharisees and Sadducees, don't presume to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. For I tell you that the Almighty is able to raise up children from Abraham from these stones. He's telling them, don't show up to my baptism with the presumption that you're okay because your ancestry goes back to Father Abraham. That would be a bad way to presume. Don't trust in your ancestral link to Abraham. The NET footnote here says, John warns his hearers that physical descent from the patriarchs, Abraham, will not suffice to save them from the coming eschatological wrath of God. That's the NET footnote. John says, Yahweh is able to raise up children of Abraham from these stones. Some commentators think that's the stony heart of the Gentiles, the tax collectors and the soldiers. That's one view. I don't think it's the best reading. I think the best reading is there's literal stones laying on the riverbank of the Jordan. And Yochanan's looking at the stone and saying, Yahweh can raise up a child of Abraham from that stone, just like He made Adam from dirt. He made Adam from the dust of the earth. The first man, Adam, Genesis 2 verse 7, was made from the dust of the earth and the breath from Yahweh's nostrils. Meditate on that. Why would you get the big head about your genetics when if you go far back enough, you came from dirt? Just like Yahweh can make a man from dirt, John says, He can make a child of Abraham from these stones. Don't show up with that presumption pulling your ancestral card out. No, don't do that. Abraham knew this in Genesis 18:27. When he spoke to Yahweh, he said, I am but dust and ashes in thy sight, before he bartered with Yahweh about Sodom and Gomorrah. Yahweh reminded Israel of that time and time again in His law by commanding them to love and take care of the foreign resident, the person who came from another people group but wanted to live peaceably with Israel, though not completely joined, Ger Toshav, or one who chose to walk in the ways of the Mighty One of Israel fully, the Ger Zedek, par oikos in the Greek, or proselytos. As I close, when someone walks into the door of this assembly and sits down to hear the word of Yahweh peacefully because they want to serve Yahweh, we should not be concerned about their last name. We should not be concerned about where they came from. We should not be concerned about what shade of color their skin is. You don't need pedigree papers to be a servant. All you need is a willing heart to be obedient. You must not exploit a foreign resident or oppress him, since you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. Don't fight it. Just obey it. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall think on it day and night. Be careful to do what Yah tells you to do, so that you will have good success. Don't turn to the right, don't turn to the left, but stay on the narrow path. Be careful to do what Yah tells you to do so that you will have good success.